I'm Jackie Leonard, and in the early hours of Wednesday, the 15th of February, these are our main stories. Much-needed aid has begun arriving in rebel-held areas of Syria from Turkey after the devastating earthquakes last week. Ukraine's Western backers have said that their military support will not falter in the face of a new Russian offensive. And a relative of the Chilean poet Pablo Neruda says forensic tests show he was poisoned to death shortly after the 1973 military coup. Also in the podcast.
This tiny diamond, which you can hold easily in the palm of your hand, has taken on the entire weight of colonial loot.
The controversial Koh-i-Noor diamond won't be used at the coronation of King Charles. Desperately needed aid started to flow from Turkey into rebel-held northwest Syria on Tuesday, just over a week after the devastating earthquakes. A truck convoy used one of the two new crossings permitted by President Assad to bring in relief, although it has come late. 9 more quake survivors have been rescued in Turkey, but the number confirmed killed in both countries is now more than 41,000. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has announced an appeal to help the victims in Syria.
United Nations is launching a $397 million humanitarian appeal for the people of earthquake-ravaged Syria, and this will cover a period of 3 months. We are in the final stages of a similar appeal for Turkey. The Syria effort brings together the entire UN system and humanitarian partners and will help secure desperately needed life-saving relief for nearly 5 million Syrians. The scale of this disaster is one of the worst in recent memory.
Our correspondent Laura Bicker has spent the day in the Turkish city of Antakya, near the Syrian border.
Every day on the streets of Antakya, relatives huddle around piles of rubble waiting for news. But rescue efforts have slowly become recovery missions, and now as workers comb through bricks and dust, the hope is of finding a body to say a final farewell. Hava Ekar sleeps here around a brazier to keep warm, just in case they find any of her 5 missing family. All of them died while screaming and trying to get help, she said. In Turkey, human life has no worth. She blames the building companies for building cheaply, not safely. President Erdogan has said the earthquake is a reminder that the country needs stricter construction rules.
James Reynolds spoke to Hanan Razek, a BBC Arabic reporter in Adana in southern Turkey, who's been getting information about the latest aid convoys which have been crossing into northwest Syria.
We know that 2 more crossing borders are open, apart from Bab el-Hawa that was open already. That gives a lot of hope for people in northwest Syria because the aid that has arrived so far, as I understand from locals they're talking to me about 84 UN aid trucks, apart from some convoys from other Arab countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar. But they've been telling me it's very little and they definitely need more. What we understand in the last couple of hours is that there are 11 more aid trucks belong to the UN that made it through the crossing. They mostly carry food aid, medical supplies and blankets and tents, which people there have been telling us that they really need blankets and carpets to put in their tents as well. I spoke to some families there and local journalists who told me that the hospitals are absolutely overwhelmed. Some of the hospitals really struggle, especially with medical supplies, and also especially when it comes to kidney dialysis, because there is a good percentage of the survivors that need, especially those with broken bones or fractures, they need dialysis processes and they are very short in supply. Families there, actually the ones we spoke to have been quite desperate to hear anything about their loved ones from under the rubble. Some of them told us really grim stories, James, about the fact that they could hear their family members the first, second and third day. They could speak to them, but afterward it was just silence.
Next to Ukraine, and the coalition of Western nations providing weapons to the country has promised it will continue to send Kiev what it needs. Representatives from more than 50 countries have been meeting at NATO's headquarters in Brussels nearly a year after Russia's invasion. Moscow has been stepping up its attacks in the east of Ukraine, but the US Defense Secretary said he expected Kiev to launch its own offensive soon. Our defense correspondent Jonathan Beale reports.
This meeting in Brussels started with NATO Secretary-General urging allies to ramp up the production of ammunition. Jens Stoltenberg warned that Ukraine was currently using up artillery and tank shells at a faster rate than NATO members were currently able to produce them. But the US Defense Secretary promised the West would ensure Ukraine got what it needed. Its forces are under considerable pressure in the city of Bakhmut right now. But Lloyd Austin said he soon expected Ukraine to go on the attack.
What Ukraine wants to do at the first possible moment is to create a momentum and establish conditions on the battlefield that continue to be in its favor. And so we expect to see them conduct an offensive sometime in the spring. And because of that, we have been working hard to ensure that they have the armored capability, the fires, the sustainment to be able to be effective.
He said 11 nations had now promised to deliver tanks to Ukraine and 19 to send air defence systems. Once again, Ukraine's defence minister came with a plea for Western jets, but there was no announcement on that. Aircraft might be a priority for Ukraine, but so far, not for its allies.
That was Jonathan Beale in Brussels. Well, as we've heard, it's nearly a year since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the Kremlin continues to wage another war against critics at home. Draconian laws have been passed to punish dissent. Public criticism of President Putin's special military operation carries the risk of a long prison sentence. Our Russia editor Steve Rosenberg travelled to the northern Russian city of Arkhangelsk to see how the Russian authorities are silencing opposition to the war.
Я фигурантка уголовного дела по 2 статьям.
20-year-old university student Olesya Krivtsova has been missing a lot of classes lately. She's under house arrest for social media posts critical of the war in Ukraine.
Пришло осознание, что в этом списке я нахожусь как террористка, а не как...
They've added me to Russia's official list of terrorists, the list that includes school shooters and groups like Islamic State. It's crazy.
Стало дико немножко.
One of Olesya's posts was about last year's attack on the bridge linking Russia to annexed Crimea and how Ukrainians were celebrating it. She's accused of justifying terrorism and discrediting Russia's army. She faces up to 10 years in prison. The police can track Olesya's every move. As she potters about the kitchen, she has an electronic tag around her ankle. Tattooed on her other leg, Vladimir Putin, in the form of a spider, with the words, "Big Brother is watching you." But in Olesya's case, it wasn't Big Brother watching her. It was her fellow students.
Ко мне подошел молодой человек, один мой знакомый.
A friend showed me a post that had been written about me in a group chat, about how I was against the special military operation. Most of the people in this chat were history students. They were discussing whether to denounce me to the authorities.
Как написать донос на меня, как это лучше сделать.
The BBC has seen extracts from the chat. One user accuses Olesya of writing provocative posts of a defeatist nature that are out of place in wartime and which must be nipped in the bud. Someone else writes, denunciation is the duty of a patriot.
Но любой народ, а тем более российский народ.
Within weeks of invading Ukraine, President Putin was calling on Russians to separate true patriots from scum and traitors. Since then, there have been reports from across Russia of Soviet-style denunciations, students informing on teachers, workers on colleagues. Propaganda in the state media encourages unflinching support for the invasion. On the streets of Arkhangelsk, we found little sympathy for Russians in trouble for criticising the war. People who discredit our army or spread fakes about the military, they're sick in the head, Konstantin tells me. They should be sent to the front line as cannon fodder. I have a negative attitude to critics of the special operation, Yekaterina tells me. I ask her, don't you think a long prison sentence for an online post is harsh? Yekaterina replies, if you live in this country, if you enjoy all the benefits of this country, if you're a patriot, you must abide by the law. Olesya is trying to stay positive.
The Russian state doesn't have the stomach for debate, democracy or freedom. But they can't put everyone in prison. At some point, they will run out of jail cells.
Olesya ending that report by Steve Rosenberg. On the 7th of July 2021, news broke of a shooting at the residence of Haiti's President Jovenel Moïse. He died at the scene with multiple bullet wounds. Haitian police alleged that the assassination was the work of a group of mainly foreign mercenaries, 26 Colombians and 2 Haitian Americans. It's been suggested that Mr. Moïse was targeted because of his attempts to expose corrupt politicians and businessmen linked to the illegal drug trade. The U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida, Mackenzie Lapointe, said the plot against the president mostly occurred in the United States.
Federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and Homeland Security Investigations arrested a United States citizen and 2 legal permanent residents living in South Florida and a United States citizen living in Tampa, Florida, for their alleged participation in the plot to forcibly remove President Moïse from office. This brings the number of defendants charged in the United States with roles in the assassination to 11.
Will Grant, our Latin America correspondent, told us more.
What's interesting about these arrests is the degree to which they really bring this situation in Haiti back to US soil. The suspects are a Venezuelan-American businessman called Antonio Intriago and a Colombian-American called Arcangel Pretel Ortiz. Now, they both were involved. Intriago was the owner of a company called CTU Security. Mr. Pretel was a representative of that company, and there was also a financier involved who's also been arrested on charges, and as well a man who's accused of smuggling goods, all linked, as you said in your introduction, with the assassination of the Haitian president, Jovenel Moïse, and it's just worth remembering how much that event really plunged Haiti onto its present course of disarray and security vacuum.
Yes, I mean, since the assassination, Prime Minister Ariel Henry has been in charge, but he's completely failed to rein in the criminal gangs, hasn't he? Just how serious is the security situation in Haiti right now?
Well, it remains very, very bad. I mean, there were obviously a lot of arrests around the time of the assassination or in the weeks and months that followed, including of 24 Colombian mercenaries, seeming mercenaries who were in the pay or working for this CTU security company, or so it seems. It does now seem certainly that the owner is likely to plead not guilty to the charges against him. But what that murder did was really open the floodgates, I think, and Mr. Henry hasn't been able to rein it in at all. If anything, the gangs continue to be stronger than ever in Haiti.
That was Will Grant. The former Republican governor of South Carolina, Nikki Haley, has announced she will run to become president of the United States. Her one-time boss, Donald Trump, appointed her as ambassador to the United Nations in 2017. Our North America correspondent, Anthony Zerka, has more details.
In a video message to supporters on Tuesday, Nikki Haley said it was time for new leadership in the U.S.
The Washington establishment has failed us over and over and over again. It's time for a new generation of leadership to rediscover fiscal responsibility, secure our border, and strengthen our country, our pride, and our purpose.
Former ambassador emphasized the threat presented by Russia and China and said she would kick back if they tried to bully the U.S. Ms. Haley was critical of Mr. Trump after the 6th January attack on the U.S. Capitol, but she said last year she would not run against him if he sought the presidency in 2024. Ms. Haley is set to kick off her in-person campaign in Charleston, South Carolina on Wednesday before traveling to Iowa and New Hampshire later this week.
I'm Alex Ritson, and in the early hours of Tuesday, the 14th of February, these are our main stories. The earthquake death toll passes 37,000 as the Turkish rescue effort starts to wind down. Also,
the White House press secretary, was slightly bizarre and amusing, said that we can definitely rule out it's not aliens, it's not extraterrestrials.
Some clarity about those mysterious objects that have been shot down over North American skies in recent days, and shocking revelations about widespread sexual abuse within the Roman Catholic Church in Portugal. Also in this podcast, a powerful cyclone triggers a state of emergency in New Zealand, and the Czech star who's become the first international player in men's football to come out as gay. A week after the devastating earthquakes in Turkey and Syria, the number of dead has now passed 37,000. And there are fears the number could even double. There are still some miraculous stories of survival, but those rescues are becoming rarer, and now the focus is more on caring for the millions who've survived. Jamie Lesueur is the head of emergency operations at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies in the Turkish city of Gaziantep.
What do people need for their basic livelihoods? It's food, water, shelter, and health. This is the priority. And so that's where our operational focus is right now. We've sort of transitioned out of the search and rescue phase. The humanitarian phase is in full swing now. And getting those four needs addressed quite comprehensively is really where the thrust of the operation is at the moment.
Jamie Lesueur. Well, also in Gaziantep is our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucet, who told me more about the winding down of the search and rescue effort.
Yes, a week on, just by the laws of science and nature, it's recognized that it is very, very difficult for people to survive. Even the stories of today, a 10-year-old pulled from the rubble, a 4-year-old child in the early hours of this morning, surviving without water to drink, much air to breathe, in freezing temperatures. But this decision about when to call off the rescue effort is regarded as one of the most painful which has to be made in operations like this, because the rescue teams, we've seen them working around the clock, determined to search for every single sign of life. The relatives who gather around these mounds of rubble, still believing in their hearts that their loved ones are still there somewhere alive, if only they dig deeper or search longer. But it is a time, of course, of limited resources and diminishing hopes. And so we saw today, for example, at the worst affected area of Gaziantep on a street which has mounds of rubble, that it was now a cleanup operation. And the areas where buildings collapse like a deck of cards, they're now almost cleaned up.
And it is just an awful thought, isn't it, Lise, that there will be people who are alive, who are underground. Just no one knows where they are or how to get them out.
Countless people have been entombed by these broken buildings. Whole streets have been turned into vast cemeteries. We saw over the weekend when we visited an area closest to the epicenter, Kahramanmaraş, where body bags were being taken out every hour on the hour from different hills of rubble, and yet the relatives waited by the side for the news they didn't want confirmed. And often when a body bag would come out, you'd see one relative and it would be written on their face exactly what the bad news was, and we'd see time and again relatives just collapsing with overwhelming grief, a grief with the weight of gravity pulling them to the ground as they realized that all hope was lost, and now here was the proof that they feared that their loved ones were dead.
And Lise, millions of survivors, what are the challenges for them?
Well, this is it. And this is millions of people. Staggering numbers across the border in Syria, more than 5 million said to be homeless. But here, too, people needing shelter in freezing temperatures, hot food to eat, a sense of a future.
Our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucet. Well, for the many injured survivors, the biggest challenge is to get adequate medical treatment. Several of Turkey's hospitals have been completely destroyed, so specialist teams have been arriving from all over the world in the past week to offer support. Our correspondent Nick Beek has been to an Israeli-run field hospital in Marash.
In the heart of this devastated city, we meet 5-year-old Aras. He was pulled from the rubble after 105 hours. He had hypothermia. His temperature was 28 degrees. Aras's brother, sister and dad were all killed in the earthquake. Sitting at his bedside and ruffling his hair, his grandfather Mehmet says he'll now treat Aras like his own son.
He's an honest boy. He has a strong personality. He's not spoiled. He's sincere. The rescuers and the doctors did so well to save him. And by God's grace, they gave him back to us alive.
Aras's mum survived and is being treated in another hospital. But this is one of so many families torn apart. And for the medics at the heart of all this, it's been an exhausting and traumatic week. Dr. Mehmet Jahan rushed here from Istanbul to help.
Yeah, it's very bad. Too much of the childs have lost their parents, so I don't know. It's very hard. Yeah, it's too hard for me.
At Turkaloo, British doctors are setting up a field hospital. The need for emergency care may have passed, but 80,000 people living in the town are lacking many services. Dr. Bryony Pointer is a GP from Chichester.
We are working with the Turkish doctors and nurses that are here, set up their own tent and are seeing patients, but they're quite overwhelmed.
Medics from around the world are now in Turkey to help with the physical injuries. But the mental trauma is also profound, both the personal and the national.
Nick Beake. And we have some news just in. The head of the United Nations Humanitarian Affairs has told a Security Council meeting that the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has agreed to open 2 more border crossings to allow in aid from Turkey. Martin Griffiths, who met President Assad in Damascus, told the Council that these borders would remain open for 3 months. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres welcomed the decision and urged Damascus to accelerate visa approvals. First came the shooting down by the US of a large Chinese balloon. Then 3 other UFOs, unidentified flying objects, shot down in Alaska and close to the US-Canadian border. The most recent object is described as an octagonal-shaped structure with strings hanging off it, floating some 6,000 metres over the state of Michigan. Washington says the balloon was used for spying by Beijing, but who owns the other 3 objects and what their purpose is has been a mystery. Well, on Monday, the National Security Advisor, Admiral John Kirby, tried to provide some clarity.
When President Biden came into office, he directed the U.S. intelligence community to do a broad assessment of Chinese intelligence capabilities and to ensure that we were working to detect and to protect against them. For reasons that you will all understand, we cannot publicly go into many details about how we discover and counteract foreign intelligence collection efforts. But we were able to determine that China has a high-altitude balloon program for intelligence collection that's connected to the People's Liberation Army.
Our Washington correspondent, Nomia Iqbal, told me more about what else was said.
They're saying that it's definitely not aliens. So at the start of the press conference, the White House press secretary, was slightly bizarre and amusing, said that we can definitely rule out it's not aliens, it's not extraterrestrials. But, you know, Alex, America is a country full of conspiracy theorists who don't always believe their government, so I don't know if she did much to quell that speculation. But in all seriousness, as we heard there from Mr. Kirby, so the 3 objects that were shot down Friday, Saturday and Sunday, the one in Michigan is lying in very deep water, same with the other objects. So they're in really remote terrain, so very hard to recover, and therefore they still don't know exactly what they are. But he did want to make a distinction between those objects and the alleged spy balloon operated by China, which was taken down nearly 2 weeks ago. They're still very clear on what that is. The other thing I really want to point out here, which Mr. Kirby emphasised, was that the US military has readjusted its radar system to a frequency where they are now detecting more objects. So he said they're seeing more because they're looking for more.
I'm still fascinated, though, by what these are, because there seems to be a growing consensus that the later ones are not balloons, and yet somehow moving around slowly, self-propelled. What do we know?
The thing Mr Kirby said was they're still calling them objects, so they're not calling them balloons, so you're right on that, and they are being propelled by the winds. We know that they're much smaller in shape, so the one that was shot down on Friday is car-shaped, the one on Saturday was cylindrical, the one on Sunday was octagonal, so very different to what they shot down on the 4th of February, which the US maintains was definitely a spy balloon. These other three, we just don't know what they are. It could be some time to find out exactly what they're intended for.
Nomi Iqbal in Washington. There were dramatic scenes outside and inside the Israeli parliament in Jerusalem on Monday as the Knesset Constitutional Committee voted to push through the first stage of proposed highly controversial reforms to the judiciary. The plans would make it easier for the government to overrule the Supreme Court, and the executive would also have more powers to appoint judges. Israel has seen some of its biggest demonstrations in years since the plans were announced last month. And Monday was no different, with tens of thousands rallying outside Israel's parliament in Jerusalem.